Good morning. As he said, my name is Brandon. We as a church have been going through a series in the book of Daniel. Daniel is a wide-angle lens at the rise and the fall of kingdoms. It was an intentional choice in the season that we find ourselves in to try to give some stable footing to you, our church, in a politically divided election season. Just thought there was some real wisdom in stepping back, looking at Daniel, taking that wide-angle lens of history. But today we're going to do something a little different. Today we're going to leave the wide-angle lens and we're going to zoom in on Jesus. And we're going to zoom in on Jesus because we thought it was wise in a season like this, in a day like this, to slow down, to look at Jesus up close with a political leader. We chose this text on purpose for its implications and applications that are universal at all times and all spaces. We're not doing a 2-hour seminar on Christianity and politics. That's not what this is. This is a slowed down, zoomed in look at Jesus before Pilate and before the crowd, looking for what are the applications for our life and how we live as the church today. This is actually the first time in the Gospels that you find Jesus with a political leader up to date. It's just been religious leaders. And so by zooming in, by looking at this scene, we can learn a little bit, not everything, but a little bit, about what the life of a Christian, the life of the church in the public and political arena should look like or could look like. It can help us answer questions like this in a politically chaotic culture. How do we live? How do we live? In a day when political factions are so far apart that it often seems like people are just speaking different languages to one another. In a time, in a day, in a culture when our civic discourse is as shallow and candidly dishonest as it is. How do we live? How do we live? What does it look like to follow Jesus? What kind of presence should we have in the world? These are actually not simple questions. These are actually complicated and complex questions that have nuanced answers that require deep reflection on Jesus. Consistent, deep reflection upon the life of Jesus, the gospel of Jesus. And if we don't do that, if we don't as a people in a chaotic world consistently reflect deeply on who Jesus is, what he did, what he taught, what his life was like, then we're going to wind up pendulum swinging from one end to the other, bouncing up and down as a yo-yo emotionally. Let me give you an illustration. Let me try to paint a picture. I want to go back to an illustration Robert used last week. It was an illustration about the 1993 Houston Oilers. It was too soon for me to have that come up in church. January 3rd, 1993, the Houston Oilers, the Buffalo Bills are playing. The Oilers had just beat the Bills the week before, 27-3. Halftime of this game, it's 35-3. By the end of the game, it's 41-38. Bills win, Oilers lose. True story. A month and a half ago, I was at the golf course and some people were talking about this game, and I walked up to them and said, "Hey, listen, politely, I need you to take that outside." I'm not kidding about that. They thought I was kidding. I wasn't kidding with them either. I will be 80 drinking coffee with my wife, and she will say, "You want to talk about it?" I'll say, "It's too soon. Too soon." At halftime, this is 2 days before my 15th birthday. At halftime, I was on cloud nine, man. I was dominating the world. Life was good. After the game, I locked my bedroom door and I cried in my bedroom. And here's what's going to happen to us if we're not people who deeply reflect on Jesus consistently. We will yo-yo between first half me and post-game me, metaphorically speaking. And so we're going to look at this scene with Jesus before Pilate, the Roman governor. Pilate's going to ask 4 questions. 2 to Jesus, 2 to the crowd. And we're going to look at them. And we're going to let them answer, what kind of presence should we have in the world? What should our presence as followers of Jesus be like? And so here are the four questions. The political question, the perplexing question, the religious question, and the theological question. All right, political, perplexing, religious, theological. Let's start with the political question. Verse 1, read with me. And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" So here's the scene. Let's set the stage as to what's happening right here. Just before this in chapter 14, Jesus is with the religious leaders and they ask him a question. They say, "Jesus, are you the Christ?" And here's his answer, "I am. I am. Are you the Messiah? Are you the Savior? Are you the one, the hope that we should be looking for? I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and come with the clouds of heaven." Are you the Christ, Jesus? Absolutely. Absolutely. And you are going to see me seated at the right hand of power. Now, this was a bridge too far for them. They knew what this meant. This was a statement of divinity. And they accuse him of blasphemy. And so they round him up and they take him to the political leaders. They take him before Pilate because this guy's a blasphemer. But here's what they didn't do. They didn't go to Pilate and say, "Hey, Pilate, this man right here, blasphemy." They didn't do that. You know why? Pilate doesn't care. Pilate's not interested in theology. For Pilate, this statement, "Are you the king of the Jews?" it's a reflection of what they must have told him. What they must have told him was, "Hey, Pilate, this man says he's the king of the Jews." And so Pilate turns and asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And for Pilate, this is a purely political question. This is a purely political question. He is asking this, are you a political leader? Is your movement, Jesus, going to have political implications? One commentator put it this way. So this designation, the king of the Jews, coming from Pilate, is a secularized form of Messiah turned into a political title, inviting the decisive intervention of Pilate. For Pilate, it meant a leader of the resistance. So Pilate is asking, are you a political leader who's going to challenge my authority? Are you going to try to unseat me? How does Jesus answer him? Verse 2, and he answered him, "You have said so." Now, Jesus' answer right here, "You have said so," it is intentionally ambiguous. In the Greek, it's actually more ambiguous than it is in the English. In the Greek, it's two words, "you saying." "Jesus, are you the king of the Jews?" "You saying?" "Are you?" "You saying?" "No, Jesus, are you the king of the Jews?" "You saying?" It is intentionally ambiguous. Now, Jesus, when he's asked, "Are you the Christ?" he is not ambiguous. He is clear, "I am." But here he is intentionally ambiguous. What he could have said, what Jesus could have said in this moment was, Pilate. No, I am simply a spiritual leader. Like, what matters to me, Pilate, is not political stuff. What matters to me is the spiritual and emotional well-being of the people that follow me. I'm strictly a spiritual leader, Pilate. But he didn't. Why? Why the ambiguity from Jesus? It's because the answer is yes and no. The answer is your movement political? Is Christianity political? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that following Jesus has civic implications. It has implications for the values we take out into the world as followers of Jesus. It forms how we live as citizens alongside our neighbors. It shapes the way we see and live in the world. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German pastor during the rise of Hitler. I think there's a movie out right now about his life. He's a German pastor during the rise of Hitler, and he really wrestled a lot with what should our role be, what should the church's role be as Hitler is on the march and on the rise. And at one point, this is what he said. He said, "We are not simply to band-aid. We are not simply to bandage the wounds of victims of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel to the wheel itself." I'm going to read that again. I just botched that quote terribly. I'm starting all over. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, looking at Nazism, said this: "We are not simply to..." God, I did it again. I did go to college, I promise. Not well, but we are not to simply bandage the wounds of victims of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself. His point was this. He looked at text like Jesus saying, love God and love your neighbor. Love your neighbor. He looked at passages like Jeremiah 29, where Jeremiah 29, Israelites have been taken captive by Babylon, and Jeremiah comes and says, hey, listen, here's what I want you to do. I want you to plant gardens and build houses and pursue the shalom of the city, that in the peace and the flourishing of the city, you'll find your peace and flourishing. Go and be great neighbors in Babylon. He applied that, and he said, listen, when you see injustice, we care for the victims of injustice, and we also do what we can to end the injustice that they're victims of. If almost universally, historians are looking back at the early church and they're saying there's some universal reasons why the gospel exploded early on. And it was this. It was that Jews cared for their own poor. Greeks cared for theirs. Africans cared for theirs. Romans cared for theirs. But Christians looked out for everyone's poor. They welcomed the others, people outside their community, into their community. They mixed races and classes because they looked and said, we are all sinners before God, and there's a level playing field in humanity. Christians, however, also were opposed to infanticide, and they had a conservative sexual ethic. When this violent plague in 165 hit and everybody fled for the mountains, Christians stayed behind, and they cared for the poor and the sick and the vulnerable, even costing some of them their own lives. They risked their lives to care for their neighbors. This is what sparked the explosion of the gospel in the early church, and what historians will look back on and say is this, that they'll say that the early church, they just didn't fit in anybody's box. There wasn't a political box that you could shove the church into. Right? They cared for everyone's poor. That sounded a little bit more liberal. They had a sexual ethic that sounded conservative. They just didn't fit in anybody's box. They risked their lives to care for their neighbors. And they would say, listen, if you want to learn from the early church, you've got to see this. You've got to see that if you think Jesus fits perfectly in your own political camp, or your own political camp fits perfectly with Jesus, then you are not thinking critically enough about your camp or Jesus. He simply doesn't. So is it political? Yeah. There are social and civic implications that flow from following Jesus. And it's no. No, because there is a king and a kingdom, and where he reigns is the church. No, because the church and the state are not the same thing. And no, because there's never been full alignment between the church and the state and the world. There will be one day, and it's after the resurrection. But it's not today. And it is crucial. If you want to go out into the world, and you want to ask and talk about and think about what kind of presence should I be having in the world as a follower of Jesus, it is crucial that you hold the tension of the yes and the no together. Because if it's only yes, you will lose sight of the distinction between the church and the state. You will leverage political power for kingdom purposes. Air quoting that. And history would say that if you see it as only yes, you will eventually justify wicked things in the name of Jesus. European and American slave trade, for example. But if it's only no, if it's no, only no, not a yes and a no, just a no, then you withdraw and have nothing to offer the world around you. You become incapable of obeying the command to love your neighbor. You can't take Jeremiah 29 and apply it to your life as you go out and live in the world. You can't be salt and light. You will end up just simply ignoring injustice. So is Christianity political? Yes and no. That's the political question. Now the perplexing question. Verse 3. I promise we're going to get moving a lot faster. And the chief priest accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you. But Jesus made no further answer, so Pilate was amazed. Here's the perplexing question for Pilate. Have you no answer to make? Jesus, have you nothing to say? Like they are leveling charge after charge against you. Jesus, have you nothing else to say? And Jesus makes no further answer. And here's why this was perplexing for Pilate. It's simply not what you did. Like Pilate's grid is if you're a movement leader, if you've got a movement that's following you, if you're attacked, you attack back. They're fighting with you, you fight with them. You don't sit there quietly and take it. You repay what they deserve. Pilate's grid was this. He knew this. Movement leaders, they are motivated by fear and power. Fear that someone is going to overpower you, so use power to squash your enemies. The driving motives in Pilate's world, fear and power. But here is Jesus doing the exact opposite. And it says that Pilate was amazed. The word amazed, it means to be struck with wonder. To be in awe of what was in front of him. And I can't help but picture this, a triangle happening where you've got Pilate, the religious leaders, and Jesus. And Pilate is looking at himself, he's looking at the religious leaders, and he's looking at Jesus, and he is seeing the contrast, and he's marveling at it. I picture him just staring at Jesus, as silent as Jesus was, in amazement and in awe of the man that is right in front of him. There are times in life where you just look up and you just see something that just strikes at your soul. It's so stunning. I'm from Houston. We have little to nothing that's aesthetically pleasing there. And I remember being 30 and the first time I got on a ski lift and got off at the top, did my best to turn around. It took a little while. I thought that was funny, by the way. And then looked out at this snow-capped horizon and just in awe of the beauty. Last April, we had our pastor and wives retreat. We have one of our pastors in Brady, Texas, named Peyton Behrens. I wish y'all knew him. He's got big curly hair. This story would make so much more sense if you knew Peyton, but I'm going to tell you it anyway. We have another pastor in Austin. They're not in our network. They might be. Doesn't matter. But this guy named, the guy's in his 50s, and he, Todd is his name, and he looks like he just stepped right out of a GQ magazine. Like, he's just the prettiest man you've been around. He's just built differently. He's very attractive. And we're at this retreat, and I'm standing there talking to Todd. Peyton hasn't met him. And Peyton walks up, and I'm witnessing this thing where Peyton turns and goes, "My God, you're beautiful." If you knew him, you would, oh man. And he just stood there staring at him. He kept telling him, holy cow, you are so good looking, man. I was like, Peyton, we want them in our network. You need to walk away, buddy. Todd is different. He's just different than me and you. He's just different. If you've ever been next to an elite athlete, and I don't mean like best on our softball team elite athlete, I mean like NFL wide receiver athlete. If you've ever been to like Olympic track and field runners and stood next to a sprinter, you look over, they're just different. They're just different. Like they are just made different. And I picture Pilate before Jesus looking at him and going, you're just different. You are different. And I can't help but think something went off in his soul in this moment. Pilate had never seen a man like this. A man who didn't overpower his enemies, who didn't fight back when he had the chance. A man who, instead of using power to destroy his enemies, used power to laid it down for the good of his enemies. Just not something that Pilate had ever seen. And so in a chaotic world that we live in, where you've got extreme right, extreme left, and everybody's raging all around us, like how could this apply? Well, here's one way this might be able to apply. That if you look out at anyone and you say, that person is my enemy's enemy and they're ready to fight, then you need to question why you're getting behind that person. You are in that moment going the way of Rome, not the way of Jesus. The way of Rome, it's all Pilate knew, and he was shocked to the core to see something different. Aren't you going to fight back, Jesus? This was the perplexing question. Now the religious question. Verse 6. Now at the feast, he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do this, as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priest delivered him up. So here's the religious question. Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? Why am I calling this a religious question when the first time you used the phrase it was a political question? It's because every commentator out there looks at this scene and says, there's a bit of mockery happening right here. He looks at the religious leaders and he sees their envy for Jesus, and he's mocking them by using the title that they gave him. Because the religious leaders, motivated by envy, knowing that Jesus was gaining a following, that he was drawing people to him, drawing their people away from them and to him, he's gaining influence, they're losing influence, and so out of envy they take Jesus, call him the King of the Jews, and hand him off to Pilate. Now, if you want to understand and see what's happening deeply in the scene right here, you've got to get inside the envy and ask what leads to envy. Like, envy is not the root. Envy is the symptom. What's inside it, what's underneath it. And what's underneath it is the same thing that motivated Pilate: fear and power. Fear that this movement is going to overtake ours, and so we're leveraging Pilate to try to end Jesus. Pilate sees this, and he mocks them. But for Pilate, this is mocking the mirror. Why is he mocking the mirror? Why the same issue for the religious leaders as the political leaders? It's because the same root issue of fear and power, it's got the same root cause. It all came from the same place. That if we go back to Genesis 3, sin enters the world, and there's this fracture, this crack in the world, this crack in humanity, this division that shows up in the human hearts. And in Genesis 3, right after sin enters the world, immediately, the immediate effect of the fall is first fear. Adam and Eve hiding from God. hiding. I'm ashamed. I'm afraid. I'm going to hide. And then one chapter later in Genesis 4, sin enters the world. They go and hide in fear. One chapter later, you have Cain killing his brother Abel. And in the text it says this, that Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. The word rose up, it's Hebrew for to show your power, to show your might, your strength, to become powerful. It's actually used in the Bible of bears standing up. Actually, I don't know if it's in the Bible. It's in Hebrew literature. I have to double check where it actually is. But it's used of bears standing up. When a bear stands up at you, what's he doing? He's trying to show you who's in charge. And so Pilate, the crowd, the religious leaders, they're all following in the shoes of Adam and Cain, driven by fear and power, because sin cracked the human heart. And the root issue that drove them to leveraging fear and power, it's alive and well in your heart and in mine. The same root issue lives inside of us. It's why we do the same thing. It's why we leverage religious practice for emotional safety. Like I don't know that I feel as loved by God as I want to feel. And so I look out for some practices, some things to do, a hamster wheel to get on, that if I just keep doing and I keep doing and I keep doing, I'll know then that he's happy with me. It's why we look to politics to deal with our fears, right? I'm afraid, understandably so, of 1,000 things. I'm afraid, so if the right political group can be in power, my fear can be assuaged. It can be cut down a little bit. As a side note, our political culture today, they are very aware of the power of fear. If you look at right and left, the discourse is all driving fear, because fear is a powerful motivator. And so if you want to be a critically thinking Christian, ask this question first. What are they trying to get me to be afraid of? And then analyze it through that lens. Think critically. And I understand that fear. I've got 4 kids. I want a world for them. I understand. But there is one sovereign who can actually be a place and source of safety for you, for your daughters, for your sons, for your spouses, for your grandkids. And he is a resurrected king over all kings. Which takes us to the theological question. But the chief priest, verse 11, stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And Pilate said to them, and here's the theological question, why? What evil has he done? What evil has he done? You want me to crucify him? Why? Why? What evil has this man done? The answer, none. What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him over to be crucified. Scourged him and then sent him off to be crucified. Scourging, to quote William Lane, commentator, theologian, this is what scourging was. It was where you were stripped, bound, beaten with leather tongs, plated with bone. No maximum strikes, so violent that men often collapsed and died from the flogging. It was the punishment for high treason. It was the punishment for high treason. Treason when you try to overthrow the government, when you try to unseat political authority. And here we are, Jesus, the silent one before his critics. What evil has he done? being handed over and punished for treason. Which is why this question, what evil has he done? It is the most important theological question the world has ever been faced with. And the answer to that question takes you straight to the heart of how God feels about you. It takes you straight to the heart about how God feels about you, because it wasn't his treason he died for. It was yours and it was mine. It was yours and it was mine. In that garden, when they took the fruit and they ate it, it was to be like God. This was divine treason. This was unseating God's place of authority in his rule and reign in our life and in the world. And here is Jesus being handed over and convicted of high treason in place of your divine treason. But this is not where the story ended. 3 days later, Jesus walked out of the grave, ascended to the right hand of the Father, and when he did, do you know what he did? He sat down. He sat down. He sat and took the place of authority so that we, you, I, the church, followers of Jesus, could live in light of his kingship, his authority, his rule and reign as we go out and extend it and live it in the world, having a redemptive presence in the world. So what does it look like to live in light of Jesus and his kingship? It looks like this. You see the world through the lens of Jesus, not Jesus through the lens of the world. You don't fit him into your view. You let him challenge every area of your life. You let him rub up against the parts that you don't want him rubbing up against. And we all have them. I do too. But you see the world through the lens of Jesus, not Jesus through the lens of the world. It means you fight against the fear that comes from misplaced hope. Listen. If the governing hope of your life is horizontal, if it's horizontal, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be job, money, kids, career, or politics. Eventually, it leads to fear, and it's the way of Rome, not the way of Jesus. And it will lead you to living this too high, too low pendulum swing. In light of Jesus and his kingship, you fight against the fear that comes from misplaced hope. That means you can live in the tension of the yes and the no, embodying Jesus in our chaotic world. The ethics of Jesus are the best ethics for the world. What it is that Jesus believed and lived and taught, this is what is best for you and for our neighbors. But to bring those redemptively to bear on the world, we have to be able to live in the yes and the no, in that tension, to have a redemptive presence, a redeemed view of power and of love. Living our life with our neighbor and for our neighbor, serving them. It means that you see power through the prism of love, something to be used for the good of others, not my own protection. Something to get out and care for the vulnerable, the marginalized. Taking our cues from that early church that in the middle of the chaotic Roman world they lived in, said, hey, we're not fitting anybody's boxes. We're going to take the ethics, the sexual ethic of Jesus, and we're going to live it, and then we're going to take the ethic that says we care for everybody's poor seriously. Redeemer, the way of Jesus is the way of love. It is the way of love. If the people who you disagree with about things that matter a lot, about serious issues that need serious thought, if the people that you disagree with question whether you love them, then you're slipping on the shoes of Rome, not the shoes of Jesus. The way of Jesus is the way of love. And so I want to say this as a bit of a closing little plea to a group of people that my family has grown to love so deeply. Don't take our battles to social media. Don't debate politics on social media. It is not the modern town hall. It is a place of disembodied dialogue, and disembodied dialogue is almost always detrimental to society. Care about things that matter and debate with people face to face, flesh and blood, where they can see you and they can see your love for them. They can see how much you care about what you're talking about. May sacrificial love be what we are known for. The way of Jesus is the way of love, and it is what the world needs. Are you the king of the Jews? Is your movement political? Pilate asks. Yes and no. May we live faithfully and humbly in that tension as a people marked by love. Let's pray.